Welcome to the NBA Slate Breakdown. I'm Jason Gilbo. Taking a look at Friday's games on FanDuel and DraftKings. Full slate tonight, dealing with some back-to-backs like OKC. You got Milwaukee. That Milwaukee team extremely banged up right now. We'll definitely be breaking that down as far as injuries go because quite a bit of value that could open up going up against the Knicks. We've seen Eric Bledsoe miss the past few games. Giannis left late in that game. Brogdon left late in that game as well. So quite a bit of value could be opening up. But diving into Indiana and Charlotte here first. 210 over under on this one. Starting with the Indiana side, I mean, really, when you look at Charlotte, a pretty average defensive team against most positions. They're a little bit better against opposing centers and shooting guards this season. You can take a look at Victor Oladipo. Been pretty pedestrian of late, just 37 fantasy points per game over his last 5. At a guy at that price tag, it's kind of tough to pay. If you're building a lot of lineups, you can certainly look his way. Otherwise, I think you can look at some other pay-up options instead. Miles Turner is questionable tonight. Domantas Sabonis would fill in for Miles Turner, of course, and get a little bit extra run. At his price really hasn't come down since coming back from, being the guy when Turner was out the last few games. Against Dwight Howard, or you look at Charlotte, they've been obviously solid against centers this season. They're 7th in defensive efficiency on the year. It's not exactly my favorite position to go. If Turner's out, I don't mind Thaddeus Young. We've seen Charlotte really struggle against power forwards of late on the season. They rate 27th in defensive efficiency. Young's intriguing given the fact that his minutes have been pretty solid. He's averaging 34 over his last 5 games, 30 fantasy points per game in that span. He'd probably be the big that I would look at there. If you want to use Darren Collison, he's not a bad option on this slate. He's averaging 35 fantasy points over his last 5 games. We look at Charlotte, they're pretty middle of the road against point guards this season. Don't have a lot of interest in guys off the bench. You can always take a flyer on Lance Stevenson and GPPs, but probably going to be some better options as far as value go tonight that'll open up the minutes. We look at Charlotte's side of things. Most of these guys are healthy. Marvin Williams is the only guy that is out tonight. Everyone else is ready to go. We start with Kemba Walker here. Indiana's been pretty decent against point guards this season. They're 3rd in defensive efficiency. These numbers, they haven't been great of late for point guards against Indiana. I'm willing to fade Kemba at his prices, but he's also been on such a roll. You can roll him out in GPPs given the upside. The minutes have been high. The usage rate right around 28%. I don't mind going that direction, but there are some cheaper point guards that I will be targeting on this slate. Love Dwight Howard in this spot. Love targeting centers against Indiana. That's going to be something I look at here. They're 28th in defensive efficiency. They're bottom half in rebounding. We look at Dwight Howard. Obviously, he's been crushing over his last 5 games, averaging 48 fantasy points. The minutes have been very solid. Don't mind Dwight Howard. Obviously, the price is very high. Once again, you should probably get lower ownership on him because people, once again, just continue to not play Dwight Howard, and especially at these prices. Nicholas Batum, decent option here tonight. We've seen Indiana struggle against shooting guards of late, bottom 10 in offensive efficiency. Batum's been solid, averaging 30 fantasy points over his last 5 games. Price is starting to creep up a little bit, but he's a safe option in cash games. GPPs, I don't mind him as well. When you look at kind of the other guys here, the guys who will be filling in for Marvin Williams, you're going to see Frank Kaminsky draw the start again, probably play around 30 minutes. Wasn't a great value last time out. I don't mind targeting power forwards against Indiana. They've been better over the last 10 games, with 27th in defensive efficiency against power forwards on the season. Kaminsky's in play for me at his price tag. You can take a flyer on Michael Kidd-Gilchrist and GPPs, Jeremy Lamb and GPPs. Guys are probably going to play right around 25, 28 minutes tonight, but just haven't been great of late. So not a tremendous game to target, but there are some options there. Atlanta and Boston, no line on this one yet, just given the fact that we're waiting on basically point guard news with Dennis Schroeder. We were waiting on point guard news with Kyrie Irving. But starting with this Atlanta side, obviously not a great matchup. But with Marcus Smart off the floor, we've seen Boston obviously take a little bit of a hit defensively. That's going to be the case here. Obviously, they still have solid defenders in Jaylen Brown. Rozier is not bad as well. Horford too. So, I mean, it's still a stout defensive team. This isn't an Atlanta team that I'm really thriving to use tonight. Kent Bazemore in GPPs is fine. He's averaging over 30 fantasy points over his last 5 games. Price is coming up a little bit. It's not a bad spot here. Boston's middle of the road against shooting guards over the last 10 games. But otherwise, I mean, you're not really looking to target this Atlanta side. You can take a flyer on Ilyasova, fairly cheap here. He's been fine. But outside of that, I mean, this has been an Atlanta team that's struggled on the offensive side. If Schroeder sits, you're likely to see, Malcolm Delaney pick up some extra run. I'm not really thrilled. I'm once again more thrilled with Bazemore here, where he sees a ton of usage. He's seen a lot of usage of late as well. So I'd be more interested in him. You're probably going to see Isaiah Taylor probably get in the game and split some time. So that's a value situation I'm not exactly thrilled with. On the Boston side of things, obviously a great matchup here. A couple of questionable tags to worry about. We got Kyrie Irving questionable. He did miss the last game. Boston didn't really miss a beat. I wouldn't expect Irving to be rushed back to play, especially in a matchup against Atlanta here. You don't expect, them to really kind of need Irving. So I kind of expect him to sit tonight and have him rest, get a little bit of a break here before the All-Star break. Once again, you would see Terry Rozier pick up a majority of the minutes, coming off a triple-double in that start. Should be pretty popular even with the price bump if Irving sits. I don't mind him here because it is such a good spot. Note that, obviously anyone that's probably stepping in for Schroeder is going to be a downgrade offensive or defensively for opposing point guards. We're going to see a little bit of a bump up, but I don't mind him here. I don't mind the secondary options as well. Jaylen Brown, Jason Tatum are all in interesting spots. You look at Atlanta, especially against small forwards, which Tatum plays about 60% of the time. They're ranked 30th in defensive efficiency. They've been struggling as late. You can continue to look that way. Marcus Morris is questionable. You're probably going to see some extra run for maybe Thies if he's out there. You're probably going to see some of these bench guys, get some run. None of them are very viable. Al Horford's always a strong cash game play. Going up against an Atlanta team that does struggle, against front court opponents. We've seen Horford bounce around a little bit from power forward to center at times this year. He's playable. Once again, this game's not that intriguing on this slate. It's probably going to be one of the mid-range totals. It's not going to compare to some of the other ones, but there's definitely some mid-range options here. No real pay-ups to worry about, but all kind of secondary guys on tonight's slate. Lakers in Brooklyn next year. Like this game quite a bit, just given the fact that there's a lot of upside for guys in the 6K range. We'll start with the Lakers side here. Two of my favorite guys, and it's kind of the case from last time as well, is Julius Randle and Brandon Ingram. When you look at Brooklyn, average rebounding team, they rank 27th in defensive efficiency against centers, 28th in defensive efficiency against power forwards. The only real position that they're great against or better against is small forward. You can probably chalk that up to DeMarre Carroll playing some solid defense. I still don't mind Brandon Ingram here. I know the DVP isn't going to be great if you go and look at him on this slate, but once again, I don't mind him. He's averaging right around 30 fantasy points over his last 5 games. The minutes have bounced back. The upside has looked to bounce back. I like targeting him against some poor rebounding teams in Brooklyn's that case. So Ingram's definitely interesting here. Randall's a solid option in all formats. 35 fantasy points over his last 5 games, 28 minutes in that span. Going up against Brooklyn, you can feel pretty safe about it. Guys like Larry Nance, Kyle Kuzma, Jordan Clarkson, all GPP options. We've seen Clarkson just kind of bounce around. He's a viable GPP option, but I'm going to be looking elsewhere in cash. We've seen his minutes over the last 2 games after playing, over 30 minutes in the previous, few games. Just 23 per game. Usage is still there, but if the play isn't, we've seen him get a little hook early. We see some other guys get some runs, so not tremendously thrilled. KCP, the one thing that was intriguing more about him is that earlier in the year when he was healthy was the fact that he played a ton of minutes, and that just really hasn't been the case of late. He's averaging 29 over his last 5 games. You can look at him in GPPs, but all these guys are kind of splitting minutes. I think Randall and Ingram are probably your safer bets here. And you can always roll on a big Clarkson game just because we know he has that 40-plus fantasy upside, especially in this matchup. Outside of that, you're not taking any real shots here. You're not digging the Brook Lopez revenge game. I mean, I guess if you're rolling 100 lineups, you can make the case for it. But for a guy who's only averaging about 16 minutes per game over his last 5, not that intriguing of a play. On the Brooklyn side, they're getting a little bit healthier. They're going to get Karis LeVert back. Rondé Hollis-Jefferson is still out. Talk about the bigs here real quick. Jarrett Allen and Jahlil Okafor, both excellent options. Jarrett Allen's a better cash game play. Okafor you can roll in GPP still, but Allen's the preferred. Averaging 25 fantasy points over his last 5 games, should see around 23, 25 minutes on tonight's slate with Hollis Jefferson out, and them just starting to kind of finally prioritize, those two over the Tyler Zellers of the world and kind of getting that direction going finally. So with the backcourt being a little bit crowded, I don't like the fact that D'Angelo Russell's price has moved up. I can understand the revenge factor, although we'd like to target the revenge factor a little bit on the road. Brooklyn's at home tonight. You can look at D'Angelo Russell on GPPs. I'm not thrilled with the price. He is a little bit cheaper on DraftKings, so I don't mind him there. But as far as as far as Alan Crabb, Karis LeVert, Spencer Dinwiddie, these guys are just not attractive options with the fully healthy Brooklyn squad. It's just the upside's a bit capped. You can use DeMarre Carroll in cash games. He's probably going to be around 25, 30 fantasy points tonight. Not a bad option, but this Nets team really just kind of a limited few to pick from. Portland and Toronto, I think this one's going to be a pretty fun one to watch. I think you're going to get a good battle between the backcourts here. You got CJ McCollum, Damian Lillard taking on Kyle Lowry, DeMar DeRozan. I have really interest in all four, a little bit more with the point guards just because they're cheaper or a little bit higher usage in some situations. But on the Portland side, I don't mind Lillard here. When you look at, obviously, this matchup, you're probably not going to see a lot of green in the defensive efficiency area. And that's fine. When you look at Toronto, obviously they're a solid defense. They've lacked a little bit against shooting guards and small forwards this season, which you can take note with McCollum. Obviously, he's coming off a monster game against Chicago. I don't mind going that direction again. Price did come up a little bit, but that's fine. Damian Lillard is the guy that I'm looking at here, and I'm looking at both point guards. And, I think obviously when you look at Lillard, people are going to be looking to fade him just because Toronto is a solid defensive team against point guards. They always have been. But, when you look at Lillard's usage, right around 30% this season, the minutes are going to be over 35 if this game stays close. He's averaging 43 fantasy points over his last 5 games. This is a type of game, staying close, going to have to put on the usage, going to have to put on a huge game to kind of compete in this one. Lillard's a viable option. You can definitely see him shooting probably about 20 times tonight. So I don't mind him for his price. Don't mind McCollum. There are some better options at the shooting guard spot. Outside of that, don't have a ton of interest. We have seen Toronto slip up a little bit against centers of late. You can always take a flyer on Nurkic. He's probable. It's just a bruise from the last game. Expect him to play. But as far as his concern, the minutes have been down of late. Fantasy production has been up, but we've seen him kind of split some time with guys like Ed Davis. We've seen him get in there. Zach Collins even. Myers Leonard's now back in probable, and for some reason, it's probably going to take like 5 minutes away from someone else. But not a thrilling front court matchup for these guys. So looking more at the backcourt there. On the Toronto side of things, I love Kyle Lowry's price tonight. He's very cheap on both sides. Right around 31 fantasy points over his last 5 games, right around 32. We've dealt with a couple blowouts, a couple games where Lowry really wasn't needed. 110 implied total here for Toronto tonight. Like Lowry, like DeMar DeRozan, we look at Portland, on the year they look great against point guards. Of late, not so much. Shooting guards have had some success against Portland this year. They're 24th in defensive efficiency. DeMar DeRozan's worth a look in GPPs. I don't expect this game to be super popular, but these guys have fairly high ceilings. Floors are solid. Don't mind going that direction. Jonas Valanciunas has played exceptionally well of late. 35 fantasy points over his last 5 games. Still only averaging right around 23 minutes in that span. You can use him in GPPs, but he's not really the exciting option because that price is up. I think I, once again, rather take a shot with Serge Ibaka, knowing that you can get right around 25, 30 fantasy points is a pretty solid floor for him. That's what he's averaging over his last 5 games. The minutes will be right around 30. We've seen Portland struggle against power forwards, especially of late. You can go that way. Outside of that, though, really over the last few games, CJ Miles questionable, Fred VanVleet is questionable. Guys like Anunoby, guys like Norman Powell will get some extra run. I don't have a ton of interest on a 9-game slate, though. Knicks and Milwaukee, total off the board here for now, just because we know that there's going to be a lot of Milwaukee news that we got to break down. As far as the Knicks go, pretty clean injury report for once. Everyone's good to go here, it seems. Some price guys that are priced down a little bit. I don't mind taking some shots against this Milwaukee team, especially if they're going to be pretty limited. Porzingis is always an interesting GPP play. I know the upside really hasn't been there of late. He's averaging 35 fantasy points over his last 5 games. Minutes have been creeping a little bit up of late with games staying closer, but a couple blowouts have hurt him. We look at Milwaukee, bottom 5 in defensive efficiency over the last 10 games. They're not a great rebounding team. This is a spot where Porzingis could be a huge mismatch if we're dealing with guys like Giannis out, Jabari Parker not, on a back-to-back here. Going to see what his minutes are going to be pretty limited. It's basically going to be Middleton and maybe Bledsoe here against the Knicks. So when we look at the Knicks side, I definitely want some exposure. I think Porzingis and Enes Kanter are both terrific options tonight. Kanter's intriguing, averaging 28 minutes over his last 5 games, 37 fantasy points over his last 5 games. I know his price is up, but we love to target centers against Milwaukee. That's going to be the case again for me tonight. Kanter's just going to be a GPP play. You can't trust this guy in cash games, but solid option. Not a great matchup for Tim Hardaway, but I don't mind him in GPPs given the usage rate and the minutes, and his price is still fairly high. But outside of that, I mean, you're taking shot on maybe Michael Beasley in GPPs, but that's about it. The point guards, it's Trey Burke, Noah Keena, Jarrett Jack, all kind of splitting minutes, and it's just not an appealing matchup anyway. On the Milwaukee side, Malcolm Brogdon, I would not expect to play tonight at all. Giannis is going to be a little bit interesting. Left late in that game, couldn't put any weight on that foot. That's a little bit of a concern. When we look at Eric Bledsoe, he's another one. We got to see if he's going to be back anytime soon. It's not the case. We're looking at a pretty depleted Milwaukee roster. You're going to see Chris Middleton with basically a sky-high usage rate on tonight's slate, I think, regardless of injuries here, just because I think one of these guys are definitely going to sit out, and that's going to open up Middleton's real true ceiling. So you expect him to be one of the more popular plays. Cash games, he's going to be a guy that I look to get in. When you look at the matchup here, you look at the Knicks, they haven't been bad against shooting guards this year, but maybe expect them to play a little bit of small forward, just given the fact that this lineup is going to be completely decimated. Expect Middleton to get a lot of run here tonight. He's going to play a ton of minutes, ton of usage. Outside of that, it's going to be guys like, Deladova. It's going to be Tony Snell. You're going to see some Sterling Brown. Maybe some guys like DJ Wilson or Rashad Vaughn. It's not going to be an attractive option here that you're going to be super excited about as far as value goes. I'm more than willing to let people eat the chalk if Milwaukee's going to give a lot of these guys options. You can use them as punts. It can be a great stars and scrubs because obviously Oklahoma City is going to be filled with star potential and upside just given the matchup. But we got to look at Bledsoe here. If Bledsoe's in, he's going to be an option I'm willing to go with, here. Getting the defense of guys like Jarrett Jack and Noah King is not a bad defender, but this is a solid matchup here for Bledsoe if he plays. Look at the Knicks, 21st in defensive efficiency. Their bottom half in fantasy points allowed this year. Bledsoe at his price that has dropped down of late would be an excellent play if he's healthy, so keep an eye on him there. If I had to take a shot on a guy that is fairly cheap, I will take a look at Tony Snell. I know the minutes will be there for him. Once again, he's just not an appealing kind of fantasy producer. That's the thing with most of these guys. So you can use them, but that's about it. John Henson might be a little bit of an interesting play here in the front court. Might see a little bit of a tick up in usage, but obviously he's not known for his offense. But this is a guy who's been fairly solid. We've seen the Knicks really struggle against opposing bigs of late. Henson, 27 fantasy points over his last 5 games, averaging right around 28 minutes. I kind of expect his floor to be a little bit safer moving forward, so I don't mind him on this slate. Miami and Philly next here, 201 total, one of the lower totals on the slate. This is a game that I don't have a ton of interest in just because these two teams have been playing really, really well defensively. It's not a huge up-pace game either. When you look at kind of Miami, there aren't a ton of options that stand out. You look at this Philly defense, it's been better of late. Shooting guards and small forwards is an area that I'm probably looking to target, but Josh Richardson's in play. He's been the safer option of the Miami team, averaging 30 fantasy points over his last 5 games, 36 minutes per game in that span. You look at Philly, 20. Sorry, they're 10th in defensive efficiency on the year against small forwards. Of late, they're in the bottom half over the last 10 games. 23rd in defensive efficiency against shooting guards this season. Little interesting guys, like Tyler Johnson, Wayne Ellington. I think Kelly Olynyk are decent GPP options. Like, these are some cheap guys you can get exposure to. Goran Dragic, I'm going to go some other directions. Once again, this guy's just been pretty pedestrian of late. 31 fantasy points over his 31 fantasy points against Cleveland. It's been his highest really over the last 2 weeks of play. It just really hasn't been great. Might be banged up still, might be a little bit tired. We've seen him get a ton of run when everyone was injured. So I don't love him here. He's cheap enough to use in cash, but that's about it. The matchup with Hassan Whiteside and Joel Embiid, I worry about here a little bit. Whiteside's a GPP option at best, as he always is. Price is down a little bit. You can use him there, but Josh Richardson's probably the most guy that I have interest in. Then you're kind of looking at maybe a Tyler Johnson for cheap, given that he'll get some extra run there. So it's about it for Miami. On the Milwaukee side, on the Philly side, not a ton of interest here either. We see Miami play exceptional defense of late. Joel Embiid, you can use him in GPPs. It's not the best matchup in the world here against Miami, who we've seen become better defensively with Whiteside on the floor, of course. We've seen Whiteside obviously be improve their rebounding of late. So Embiid's decent. I don't know how much I'll be paying that price. I don't like Ben Simmons at that price. Miami's just not a team that I'm really looking to target. You can take a shot on a Dario Saric here for cheap if you don't want, to go up and get the Ben Simmons and Joel Embiid. Saric continues to be a 30 fantasy point type guy. But that's about it. You're not really looking to target this team heavily unless something comes out or some weird injury news comes about. This is a game that's fairly low total, probably going to be pretty grinded out. We're going to get to about 3 good games here next that feature a lot more options. So we'll move on. Utah and Phoenix. I'll start with this Utah side. Guys who are out still, Rodney Hood. I know Dante Exum's working his way back. When we look at this backcourt, Ricky Rubio, been fantastic of late, 30 fantasy points per game over his last 5. The minutes have been back up. Gets a great matchup against Phoenix. They're 30th defensive efficiency against point guards. We look with Rodney Hood. Alec Burks is an excellent punt option on tonight's slate. He's extremely cheap. You can use him. He's going to get minutes. He's probably going to play around 25 minutes tonight against this Phoenix team that ranks 24th in defensive efficiency against shooting guards. I really like both those guys quite a bit. They're excellent values. I'm going to be using them pretty much as a core on tonight's slate because they're going to pony up some spots that I want some cash in. So definitely options. Donovan Mitchell's not bad, but when we've kind of seen Rubio and Burks here possibly kind of get around a better value, points per dollar value, it makes those guys even more attractive. Donovan Mitchell's price really still hasn't come down. He's averaging 31 fantasy points over the last 5 games. There's better upside plays, and I think there's better cash game plays. It wouldn't surprise me to see him go off, but I just don't love the price for his recent production. Derek Favors is interesting because we love everyone against the Suns. You look at power forwards against the Suns this year, they're 30th in defensive efficiency, bottom 5 in fantasy points allowed. Favors 33 fantasy points over his last 5 games. Prices come down a little bit, obviously, with Gobert back. The minutes have kind of come back down a little bit, but at his price, 27 minutes per game over his last 5. As I mentioned, 33 fantasy points per game over his last 5. Very attractive option at his price. Will go overlooked on tonight's slate. You can definitely use him. Rudy Gobert, very interesting option. He's been solid of late. Obviously not a big usage or offensive guy. Should be in line for a double-double here tonight. You look at Phoenix average in defensive efficiency against centers and fantasy points allowed. We've seen Gobert really put up some big games against Phoenix this year over his last 5 games career-wise. So Gobert's a guy I expect to kind of get overlooked just because I don't think people are going to completely pay his price tag. So you can definitely go that way. Not really interested in anyone else. Joe Ingles may be the other name here. He's fairly cheap, especially on FanDuel where you got a roster 2 small forwards. He's only 4,800. With Hood out, it's another less body to kind of shove in there. So he's going to probably play around 31 minutes. 26 fantasy points per game over his last 5. Once again, Phoenix, another attractive option to attack with small forwards. So Ingles also very much in play. On the Phoenix side, I don't mind going here, and I don't want people to be scared off by this Utah defense. I know they're fine with Gobert on the court, but looking at some shooters, though, the one guy that I'm off of a little bit here is T.J. Warren, because he does get his shots at the rim quite a bit. And Gobert's obviously a guy who is a solid rim protector. I'm a little bit off him, but Devin Booker is an interesting GPP option. The cash game viable on DraftKings. You can play him on all formats here. Devin Booker's solid, 36 fantasy points per game over his last 5. The price tag's not bad. The usage is going to be right around 30%. We look at this Utah team, just really have not been a team that struggles against. They struggle defensively against shooters. And when we look at that, obviously you like guys like Devin Booker. That's about it as far as shooters go here that I'm really intrigued with. I know obviously they're going to be a little bit shorthanded in the backcourt with Cannon off the floor. You're going to see Troy Daniels and probably Tyler Ulis get some run. For the most part, that's about it. You're probably going to see Josh Jackson be the biggest beneficiary here just because they're going to probably play a little bit of Devin Booker at the point. We can see Josh Jackson play the 2 and the 3. So I don't mind Josh Jackson, actually. He's a guy, he's coming off a big game against Dallas. He's a guy, when the shot's there, he's going to be fine, but he rebounds in back-to-back games. Gobert is obviously a guy who's Utah's a better rebounding team with Gobert on the floor, but it's only kind of brought him to about an average rebounding rate this season. So I don't mind going with Jackson even with Booker back. Obviously, we know the usage is going to be a little bit lower, but he's a much more intriguing option than Warren for me tonight. So I actually like this game quite a bit. 211 total, but a lot of interesting mid-range options, and these two defenses really, especially Utah's not as good as it seems. So New Orleans and OKC next here. Obviously, when we break down the New Orleans side, Anthony Davis is going to be where we start. 58 fantasy points over his last 5 games. He's actually been pretty well against OKC in the past. Obviously, it's not a great matchup on paper with Steven Adams, but Davis is obviously just a huge mismatch. The usage rate's going to be there. I don't mind going with Davis. He's expensive. You can look to build around him. But the guy I do like here quite a bit is Drew Holiday. Andre Roberson off the floor, of course. OKC has struggled against shooting guards of late. Holiday's a guy who's averaging 18 field goal attempts over his last 2 games. The usage rate is going to tick up a little bit with Cousins off the floor. He's going to play huge minutes. 38 fantasy points per game over his last 5. Holiday's my kind of more preferred option if you're going with a more balanced economic approach when building lineups, just because the Davis price tag. 12-3 on FanDuel. He's in the 11s on DraftKings. You can certainly look to build around him there. I think that was the case last time around. It was more intriguing. As far as the rest of the guys go, you can look at Etuan Moore. He is going to be a guy who does get some extra shots with Cousins out. You don't expect Mirotic to play on tonight's slate. He was traded yesterday. We'll obviously have to see if they make any other moves like a Greg Monroe coming in. So Mirotic is going to play just yet. You're probably going to see a lot of Darius Miller run. He's cheap. He's not a great fantasy points per minute player. If you need someone cheap and want someone who's going to get some run, I don't mind it. But one thing, I think Etuan Moore has a little bit higher ceiling. He's a better fantasy points per minute producer, so I think I'd rather go that direction. But that's about it for New Orleans. You definitely look at the main guys here more. If you really need to go Miller, you can go that way, but I try to find the money to go with Moore instead. On the OKC side, if you missed that game, go check out the highlights. That was a fantastic game in Denver last night. Paul George and Gary Harris went head-to-head with shots in the last basically 10 seconds of that game. OKC on a little bit of a tough back-to-back leaving Denver. That's always tough. But it's such a good matchup here. Willing to go back to the well with all these guys. It's the usual suspects for me. You can definitely look. Never going to say no to Westbrook. Usage rates there. Production's been there. It's going to be there against New Orleans tonight, who are just not a good defensive team, especially against point guards. So Westbrook's fine. Guy that I have a lot of interest in here is Paul George. Coming off a massive game. His production has just been terrific. We know the steals are going to be there. That's what we like to see. The shot's been there. He's shooting over 50% each of the last 3 games. We've seen some big ceiling games out of him. He's been fine on back-to-backs. He's averaged 44 fantasy points on 0 days rest this year. So I'm fine with George there. Steven Adams is the other one. Doesn't take a huge decline on back-to-backs, just a 2-point fantasy point drop, and that's about it. We look at Adams. He's been better at home this year, averaging 34 fantasy points per game. This New Orleans team, obviously, he's going to be having to deal with Davis, but that's not something that just makes it completely drop off of him. He's a guy who's probably going to be around 30 fantasy points tonight, pretty safe cash game option. And in this spot, I actually don't mind the upside as well. We look at New Orleans this year. On paper, overall, they look decent in defensive efficiency against centers, but fantasy production says otherwise. I'll lean with the latter there. Outside of that, Carmelo Anthony is a guy that I'm, had the big game against Washington, had a big game against Detroit. Other than that, he's been complete crap. GPPs, you can use him in at his price and kind of hope for that 35 fantasy point game. Doesn't have much out of that. I know he played well against Cleveland a while back, but this is a guy who just really hasn't topped 40 fantasy points much this year. So weird to say that from a guy who I just find more interesting in GPPs, but at his price, you can get a decent bargain on him if you can get around 35, 40 fantasy points, which in this matchup is certainly possible. I don't have a lot of interest in the GPP guys. I know Jeremy Grant's coming off a big game. He played 24 minutes, 31 fantasy points. Not really looking to chase that one. So Westbrook, Paul George, Steven Adams, you can take a flyer on Melo and GPPs. That's about it here. Those guys are logged in a majority of the minutes anyway. Nothing else really of use. Golden State and Sacramento, 221 total, the highest on the slate so far. The only one that maybe might surpass it is New Orleans and OKC, but we'll see. Obviously, a great matchup for all these Golden State players. When we look at them, guys that you want exposure to, I think you're kind of looking at the cheaper guys once again, like a Klay Thompson, Draymond Green. We know Sacramento struggles against shooting guards. They struggle against guys that hit the three. Splash Brothers here very much in play. When we get kind of a full slate of all-stars, you can always look at Curry as an option, and GPPs as a pivot away from other guys. We've kind of seen the production stagger a little bit here of late. Durant over his last 5 games, 45 fantasy points per game. Curry, 44 fantasy points per game. Draymond, 34 fantasy points per game. Klay Thompson, 27. Like pretty pedestrian numbers for those guys because they're fully healthy. They've been kind of going with the balanced fantasy production move. I think Curry is an excellent GPP option. You can look to use Durant on this slate. Draymond Green, I do have quite a bit of interest in just because he's the cheaper guy and he doesn't have to score to produce fantasy points. Klay Thompson's the guy that I do have a lot of interest in here. Sacramento 20th defensive efficiency. Not a bad option here for Thompson, who can hit the three. They're bottom 5 in 3-point percentage allowed. Once again, all 4 very playable. All 4 playable in GPPs. You can use Thompson, Green, cash games. Durant's a safe cash game option, but you're probably going to be looking to spend more wisely. Outside of that, you're going to see guys like Iguodala, David West, Pachulia kind of get some extra run off the bench, but none are really worthy on tonight's slate. So stick with the main guys there. Sacramento, obviously, we're going to have to look and basically wait till this injury report clears out. Zach Randolph, questionable. Costa Kufos, questionable. Garrett Temple, questionable. George Hill, questionable. We'll say this. I like De'Aaron Fox. I think Willie Cauley-Stein's a very interesting GPP play. Keep an eye on his health. He was due back on tonight's slate. Should be a fine option. Give me the scores here. Guys like De'Aaron Fox, Buddy Hield. Randolph's interesting if everyone else, if Kufos sits. He's just a little less interesting given the fact that Cauley-Stein is going to be back. Probably going to see him play around 25 minutes again if that's the case. But I don't mind those guys in GPPs just because Skal Labissière is out. So those guys are going to have to pick up plenty of minutes. But keep an eye on Kufos. If we kind of get a full healthy rotation of guys, like it's probably going to be a little bit split and you're kind of just more looking at like Hield and Fox. But these guys are all attractive options. We've seen Golden State kind of play down to opponents of late. Look at these positions like, Golden State's middle of the road defensive efficiency against point guards, small forwards, centers is kind of where they can get beat up at times. That's where I kind of like Willie Cauley-Stein GPPs. Last time out, we saw Cauley-Stein put up over 40 fantasy points in 29 minutes. Don't overlook him if he goes tonight. So That's going to wrap it up for me. Plenty more news is probably going to be coming out as the day goes on. It's only 10 o'clock in the morning Eastern time, so it's probably going to be the case. Try to get that as best as I can. Definitely check out DFC Cafe on Twitter. We're always tweeting out news and fixing our stuff and getting news out there. So check that out. Cheat sheets, GPP article will be up today as well. And good luck and have a great weekend.